Behold my technology at work.
That's basically taking my job.
That is the Starship Enterprise of farming.
That went well.
Error detected, localization, hitch, tall link, fold off.
What happens when the world's funniest farming show suddenly stops being funny? One failed cattle test pushed Jeremy Clarkson's diddly squat farm into a 7-month lockdown. A healthy, pregnant cow was slaughtered after a false alarm. Clarkson faced a life-threatening cancer diagnosis. The farm suffered one of its worst harvests ever, and losses kept piling up. Yet somehow, diddly squat survived when many ordinary farms might not have. So what really happened behind the cameras, and what does it reveal about modern farming? In today's video, we uncover the truth, the emotional moments, and the lessons behind Clarkson's toughest year. When the comedy turned into reality, for 4 seasons, Clarkson's farm ran on a fairly reliable formula. A hapless millionaire attempts real agriculture. The weather and the paperwork conspire against him, and somehow the whole mess turns out funnier than it should. Bad harvests, feuding neighbors, an ongoing war with the local council over what counts as a legitimate farm building. All of it played out as comedy, because at the end of the day, nobody's life was actually on the line. Season 5 broke that formula before the opening credits had even finished rolling. Every farm running cattle in England lives under a routine 6-monthly bovine tuberculosis test. A blood draw, a weight, and normally, a return to business as usual. Clarkson described how easy that routine becomes to stop taking seriously. "It's awful," he said on Times Radio afterward. "You have a test every 6 months on the cows, and then you sort of become blasé. It's a hypothetical threat. Nobody writes a show around a hypothetical. Real farms live with one anyway, year after year, until the day it stops being hypothetical entirely." That day arrived on a Friday at the start of August, in the form of a vet's phone call nobody scripted and nobody wanted. Clarkson recalled the moment with the kind of specificity that only comes from something that actually happened to you. The vet looked up the way people do when they already know the news is bad, and told him one animal had failed its test. "I'm really sorry. This one's failed," he remembered being told. "So that means we're now locked down, and it's just dreadful. Absolutely dreadful." One result, one phone call, and the entire operation stopped functioning as a normal business that same afternoon. Is there a cleaner definition of dramatic irony than a show built on turning misfortune into comedy, suddenly facing a misfortune with no comic angle available? A lockdown isn't a plot device, it's a legal restriction. Diddly Squat could not buy cattle. It could not sell cattle. Every animal on the property stayed exactly where it was, indefinitely, while a process that was supposed to take 2 months eventually stretched to 7. Only the farm shop, the retail side of the operation, kept its doors open through all of it, absorbing pressure the livestock side would normally help carry. Caleb Cooper, whose years of work had gone into building that cattle operation from almost nothing, watched breeding schedules and sale plans freeze overnight, along with everything else. A writer plotting a season arc might introduce a setback like this in episode 2, then spend the rest of the run resolving it neatly by the finale. Real bovine TB regulations don't care about pacing. They simply hold, for as long as they hold, regardless of how many episodes are left to film. Lisa Hogan, Clarkson's partner and a fixture of the show since its earliest seasons, played a role in this stretch that no scripted character arc would have assigned her. Where Clarkson's on-screen instinct has always leaned toward loud frustration, Hogan spent the lockdown handling the unglamorous, unfilmable logistics, keeping the shop's supply chain functioning, managing customers who had no idea a crisis was even unfolding a few hundred yards away. Television dramas tend to give their steadying characters a big monologue moment. Real farm crises mostly just need someone quietly answering the phone. The scale of what was suddenly frozen also went beyond cattle alone. Diddly Squat had expanded well past a single working farm in the years leading up to the outbreak, adding a restaurant, a farm shop that had become a genuine retail destination in its own right, and a country pub purchased the year before. A screenwriter plotting a crisis usually isolates it to one storyline, so the rest of the plot can keep moving. A cattle lockdown doesn't respect that kind of narrative tidiness. Livestock, produce, and the shop's own supply lines are tangled together closely enough that a disruption in one corner of the operation is felt everywhere else within weeks, whether the story wants it to or not. Bovine tuberculosis itself was never a fringe concern waiting to be dramatized for effect. It remains the single biggest disease threat facing British farming, a chronic and expensive problem that forces widespread culling nationwide most years, regardless of which specific farm happens to be affected. Diddley Squat wasn't an unusual case chosen for its storytelling potential. It was simply the most publicly documented example of something happening to farms across the country constantly, mostly without anyone outside the immediate community ever hearing about it at all. The cow that never had TB. Good fiction usually gives its saddest moments a reason. The character dies so another character can grow, or learn something, or change course. Real bovine TB testing offers no such courtesy, and the animal who proved that point was the very first cow Clarkson ever bought, one of the original members of the herd, present since the earliest, clumsiest episodes of the show's run. By the time the outbreak hit, she was pregnant with twins, carrying forward a herd Clarkson had spent years learning to manage, mostly by getting it wrong in front of cameras. The testing protocol treats an inconclusive result with the same seriousness as a confirmed positive, because the cost of missing one infected animal outweighs the cost of removing a healthy one by mistake. This particular cow returned 2 inconclusive readings rather than one clear negative. Under the rules governing the outbreak, that was enough on its own. She was sent for slaughter. No confirmed diagnosis required, only enough uncertainty to trigger the protocol. Would any writer choose to kill off a founding character for a disease that turns out, after the fact, not to exist? That's precisely what happened next. The post-mortem came back clean. No trace of bovine tuberculosis anywhere in her body. A pregnant animal, present since the show's very first year, was gone, and the test that killed her had been wrong the entire time. Clarkson did not soften his reaction for the cameras. He described his blood boiling once the results came in, confirming a healthy animal had died under a system built specifically to avoid exactly that outcome. And here's the detail no scripted drama would ever include, because it offers no catharsis at all. Her death changed nothing about the farm's legal status. Diddley Squat remained locked down for another full month regardless, exactly as if the post-mortem had gone the other way. Real consequences, unlike fictional ones, don't reverse themselves just because the underlying fact turns out to have been wrong. Farmers who have lived under this same testing system for years describe watching it play out this exact way long before Diddley Squat's cameras ever caught it happening on screen. It is a policy built for statistical safety across an entire herd, not for the certainty of any individual animal's case, which means stories like this one are not rare exceptions to the system. They are the system working precisely as designed, just rarely captured by anyone with an audience large enough to notice. Veterinary professionals who work with these tests regularly describe the underlying math bluntly. Skin and blood tests for bovine tuberculosis are not perfect instruments, and false positives or inconclusive readings happen at a rate high enough that regulators built the entire system around erring toward caution rather than certainty. A scripted procedural might dramatize that tension across an entire episode, the agonizing choice between 2 imperfect options. In reality, there was no dramatized choice at all, just a protocol executed exactly as written, with an outcome nobody involved had the power to appeal in time. The scene's position in the season only sharpened how it landed with the audience. It arrived early, well before viewers had any sense of how the wider outbreak storyline would eventually resolve, and it set an emotional register the rest of the season never really shook off. A comedy about incompetent farming does not usually open its darkest chapter with a wrongful death in the first act. This one did, and it never really apologized for that choice, because there was no writer to apologize on the story's behalf. only events that had already happened before a single frame was edited together. There's a version of this story a screenwriter might have chosen instead, one where the wrongful death becomes a turning point, a moment that forces the testing system itself to change in response. Nothing like that happened here. The rules that sent a healthy, pregnant cow to slaughter remained exactly the same rules governing every other farm in the country the following week, the following month, and the following year. Real institutional systems rarely rewrite themselves in response to one heartbreaking case, no matter how many people happened to be watching when it occurred. Her calves, lost along with her, never get a scene of their own in any version of this story, scripted or otherwise. That absence is its own kind of honesty. Fiction tends to give every death narrative weight, a purpose attached to the loss. These two never existed long enough to be characters at all, only a statistic buried inside a larger one, which is exactly how most real agricultural losses actually register. Quietly, without a name attached, easy to skip past unless someone happens to be telling the story. When Clarkson faced his biggest battle, every writing workshop teaches some version of the same rule. Don't stack too many disasters on your protagonist at once, or the audience stops believing any of them. Real life ignores that rule constantly, and Season 5 of Clarkson's Farm is a case study in exactly how far it can be ignored. While the herd sat frozen under quarantine, Clarkson was managing a second crisis entirely unrelated to cattle, one that opened the season with a heart procedure, a storyline dramatic enough to headline any other year on its own. It turned out to be a warm-up for something heavier. In the finale, Clarkson told his closest colleagues on the farm, Caleb Cooper and Charlie Ireland, that he had been diagnosed with an aggressive cancer. He kept the specific location private, even as the diagnosis itself reached viewers through the show. Picture the scene from the other side of the camera for a moment. How do you keep filming a comedy about farming while telling two people you work with every day that your future just became uncertain? Clarkson let the cameras stay on anyway. The line that closed the season is the one fans still quote. Lying in a hospital bed, Clarkson said directly to the camera, "Some of the treatment has gone awry, let's say. I'm going to be here for a little while. I don't know what's going to happen. If this is all successful, I'll see you for Season 6. And if it isn't, I won't." No screenwriter builds a season finale around genuine uncertainty about whether the lead will be alive for the sequel. This wasn't a cliffhanger engineered for a renewal announcement. It was a man being honest about not knowing his own outcome. He later told the Sunday Times the diagnosis was prostate cancer, and that treatment brought complications beyond what he'd expected. A catheter, then an incident involving blood-thinning medication he had taken for his heart when he shouldn't have. Horrific, he called it, adding it was all my own fault, and at one particularly bad point, quite spectacularly painful. Months later came better news. A clear prostate test, official remission, and Clarkson calling himself the world's luckiest man for surviving both scares inside the same stretch of his life. Longtime viewers had spent 4 seasons watching this show turn hardship into comfortable, low-stakes comedy. Nothing in that history prepared anyone for a finale where the show's own star spoke, on camera, about the possibility of not returning at all. Social media reflected that shift immediately, fans flooding replies with genuine concern rather than the usual jokes about tractors and planning permission, a tonal break the audience registered before any official update on Clarkson's prognosis ever arrived. Caleb Cooper and Charlie Ireland's reactions in that finale carried a weight that no amount of rehearsal could have manufactured. These are two men who have spent years building the show's comic chemistry with Clarkson. The bickering, the good-natured insults, the running jokes about who actually understands farming better. Watching that same chemistry absorb a diagnosis instead of a punchline was jarring precisely because nothing about their reactions looked performed. Actors playing shock can choose exactly how much to show. Two colleagues actually receiving the news don't get that same control over their own faces. What makes the choice to keep filming even more striking is how consistent it was with everything the show had already established about itself. Diddley Squat has never presented a polished version of farm life. Every financial loss, every dead animal, every heated argument over a decision gone wrong has made it to air largely unfiltered across 4 earlier seasons. Turning that same camera on his own mortality wasn't really a departure for Clarkson. It was the show doing exactly what it had always done, just aimed at something with far higher stakes than a rejected planning application. Clarkson's own account of the recovery period added another layer that a tidier narrative would likely have smoothed over entirely. Rather than describing a clean medical resolution, he described genuine complications along the way. Mistakes made under stress, treatment that didn't proceed as planned, physical pain severe enough that he later called it close to unbearable. A scripted illness storyline usually resolves through a single decisive medical breakthrough. This one resolved through months of imperfect, occasionally self-inflicted setbacks that simply, eventually, stopped happening. When the good news didn't last, fiction owes its audience a resolution. A season finale is supposed to close a loop, deliver relief, and let everyone exhale before the credits roll. By March of 2026, it looked like Diddley Squat might finally get exactly that kind of clean ending. Clarkson announced it himself, in a column for The Sun. After 7 months of lockdown, Diddley Squat Farm became officially TB-free this week. 7 months without one of the farm's core revenue streams had ended. The herd was clear. One outcome inside the ordeal had already gone exactly right, with no asterisk attached. Endgame the bull, an animal fans had followed closely across several seasons, never contracted the disease at all, and came through the entire lockdown in full health. In a storyline built almost entirely from loss, his survival was the rare beat that required no correction later, no bittersweet footnote, nothing to walk back once the full facts came in. Real life, unlike a season finale, doesn't know when to stop. Before the relief of the TB-free announcement had even fully landed, a donkey on the farm was diagnosed with laminitis, a painful and often unmanageable condition affecting the hooves, severe enough that the only humane option left was to put her down. What kind of story hands its characters good news and immediately takes something else away before they can enjoy it? Clarkson answered that question himself, better than any narrator could. In farming, it seems you are allowed one bit of good news, but it must always be accompanied by some kind of disaster. That line is as close as this entire saga comes to a thesis statement. Not a single crisis with a clean beginning and a clean ending, but setbacks arriving in a rolling sequence, each one revealing the next before the previous one had even finished. The TB outbreak was technically over. The farm's run of bad luck evidently was not. Which is exactly the kind of untidy, unresolved rhythm no writer would ever choose to build a season around on purpose. Charlie Ireland, the farm's land agent, and the man usually left explaining the numbers behind every setback, later called the 7-month stretch one of the hardest periods to plan around in the show's history. Not because any single event was unprecedented on its own, but because an open-ended lockdown made it nearly impossible to budget beyond the next scheduled test. A screenwriter can decide when a crisis ends. Nobody running an actual farm gets that same luxury. Endgame's clean outcome mattered for reasons beyond simple relief, too. As one of the animal's viewers had followed most closely across multiple seasons, his survival gave the audience something the rest of this storyline had almost entirely withheld. A resolution that required no follow-up correction, no post-mortem walking anything back, nothing bittersweet hiding underneath it. Every other major beat connected to the outbreak had arrived, wrapped in some form of loss. Endgame simply made it through intact, which is precisely the kind of clean, uncomplicated victory a writer would normally save for the very end of a season rather than burying it in the middle of a still unresolved crisis. The donkey's laminitis diagnosis offered no such simplicity in return. The condition is notoriously difficult to manage, even under the best circumstances, often progressing fast enough that euthanasia becomes the only humane option once it passes a certain point. For an animal living on a farm that had just spent 7 consecutive months absorbing one setback after another, the timing read almost like a test of how much resilience the team had left in reserve. Except nobody was actually testing anything. It was simply what happened next, with no dramatic irony intended by anyone, because there was no author left to intend it. Fans processing the TB-free announcement online reflected that same tension in real time. Many reacted with genuine relief, mixed with a kind of dark, knowing humor, pointing out that a diddly squat update, without some accompanying setback, would have felt almost unfamiliar by that point in the show's run. 5 seasons had trained the audience to expect exactly this rhythm. Recovery followed closely by fresh misfortune, rarely one arriving cleanly without the other close behind it. Charlie Ireland's frustration with the open-ended nature of the lockdown reflected something bigger than a single farm's bookkeeping headache too. Every business with any predictable seasonal rhythm builds its planning around known variables: expected costs, expected timelines, expected windows for buying and selling. An indefinite quarantine removes all three at once, leaving even an experienced land agent working from guesses rather than numbers for months at a stretch. The truth behind Diddly Squat's survival. Every dramatic arc needs a reason its protagonist survives to the end, and this one has an answer, just not the kind that would work in fiction, because it isn't flattering enough to invent. 2025 was already a brutal year before bovine TB entered the picture at all. Clarkson called it the worst year ever on the farm, citing a combination of heat waves and drought that produced a harvest he described bluntly as shocking, the kind of season that strains any agricultural operation, even without a disease outbreak layered on top of it. Clarkson didn't dodge the harder version of that question when a fan raised it directly online. Responding to criticism about turning farming hardship into entertainment, he wrote, "If a disaster on this scale had befallen any other industry, there would be a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth." When the fan pushed back, arguing the ongoing drama at least made for compelling television, Clarkson's reply landed closer to the truth than anything scripted could. Yes, but most farms don't have TV shows to keep them going. Sit with that line for a moment, because it undercuts the entire premise this story has been building toward. The most famous farm in Britain, the one turning a disease outbreak and a cancer diagnosis into some of the most watched television Prime Video has ever produced, is openly admitting the show itself is what kept the underlying business solvent. Is that not a stranger ending than anything a writer could have invented? Not the failed test, not the cow, not even the diagnosis, but a plain admission that without cameras and a streaming contract, this exact chain of setbacks might have ended the farm entirely. That admission reaches well past one Cotswolds property. Thousands of British farms weathered the same drought, the same heat waves, and often the same disease pressures that year, with no television deal cushioning any of it. Bovine TB alone forces tens of thousands of cattle culls nationwide in an ordinary year, hitting farms with no camera crew to document the loss and no audience of millions rallying behind their recovery. Their version of this story doesn't get a season finale. It simply ends, sometimes for good, in the quiet way farm closures usually do, off-screen, unscripted, and unwatched. This wasn't the first time Clarkson had put himself in the middle of the wider pressures facing British agriculture either. In November of 2024, he joined thousands of farmers marching through central London against inheritance tax changes, introducing a 20% tax on inherited agricultural assets above £1 million, a policy critics warned could force family farms to sell land simply to cover a bill triggered by a death in the family. Diddly Squat's own outbreak arrived less than a year later, stacking a disease crisis directly on top of a fight Clarkson had already been warning could push struggling farms past their limit. None of this diminishes what Clarkson's team actually pulled off across those 7 months. Keeping a farm running through a lockdown, a wrongful animal death, a cancer diagnosis, and one of the worst harvests in memory is a genuine achievement, regardless of what funded the recovery. The uncomfortable part isn't that the ending was undeserved. It's that the safety net making it possible, an audience, a contract, a shop built on the show's own fame, simply isn't available to the vast majority of farms living through the same script, with no one watching and no way to write themselves a better ending. Fiction generally insists a protagonist's survival be earned through some internal change, a lesson learned, a flaw corrected. Clarkson's farm survived for none of those reasons. It survived because a streaming platform had already turned his earlier failures into a hit show, and that revenue happened to be large enough to absorb a catastrophic year that would have ended a farm without one. That is not character growth. That is simply the difference between having an audience and not having one. And it's the part of this story most viewers never see play out for the farms that don't. A vet's call nobody scripted. A cow whose death solved nothing, even after the truth came out. A hospital bed confession with no promised ending. A donkey lost the same week the good news arrived. None of it followed a story arc, because none of it was written. It just happened, in that order, to real people and real animals with no author deciding how it would turn out. Clarkson survived his own diagnosis. The herd survived its lockdown. But the truest line in the whole saga wasn't about cancer or cattle. It was the quiet admission that most farms don't have a camera crew keeping them alive. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Hit like and subscribe for more.